Okay. All right. So yeah, welcome to our second lecture in this lecture series hosted by the Rising Tide Foundation. Last week, many of you were here to experience the first inaugural lecture over Zoom featuring Aaron Kelfin, who won't be with us this week or next, where he was able to go through a bit of an introduction to universal history from the standpoint of the figure of St. Augustine of Hippo from North Africa, who was a unique figure who was able to enter into a particular stage of crisis at the end of an empire that was collapsing, which was around, the first sacking of Rome occurred in 410. He was already about 50 years old, the leader, political leader within his society, but he took a stand to both fight off the danger to the existence of Christianity per se at this fragile time that was being caused by two simultaneous crises. Number one, the population was largely, and the leadership of Rome was largely looking for a scapegoat to blame the collapse of Rome upon, Christianity being the number one, which had recently become the sort of state religion. Basically, the idea was that the gods must be punishing the Romans for having abandoned the pagan gods, the mystery religions, which was very dangerous. The other aspect was that a lot of the pagan mystery religions were that were dominant in the Roman pantheon, that the Roman Empire used to control their subjects through very controlled cults. It was basically a society of cults. A lot of them had basically put on a new garment, a new costume, to pass themselves off as different forms of Christian sects, but that held very deeply embedded, dangerous ideas like the denial of truthfulness. There are many of these different forms of Gnostic and mystical sects, and they were really taking a lot of the potency out of, and the moral foundations out of Christianity at the time. So Augustine waged a multi-level battle on an epistemological level, a moral one. His point to the Roman Empire was that the problem, like Aaron said, of Rome is that it was founded upon faulty ethics, that the idea of man was based not upon principle, but rather upon certain fallacious ideas of, basically that the empire itself was founded upon conquering and extending itself beyond morality to subdue people into its will. And just by setting up a society founded upon that type of structure, it was doomed to itself collapse, which we're going to go through a little bit in our current presentation. I'm going to just start a screen share here. So this part of our presentation, this lecture I titled Khazaria and the Forgotten Jewish-Christian-Muslim-Confucian Alliance. It's a bit of a mouthful, and it's based upon a study I did a few months ago that I turned into an article. I'm going to be going through some of the material from my report, but also a lot of stuff I was not able to include in that research paper. A few words, again, just for you all. I've never tackled this type of research project before. It involves a lot of history and a lot of different cultures. Usually people study one civilization or another. They look at one specific period of time or another. This doesn't allow for that type of liberty, whereby I'm actually dealing with a large period over a couple hundred years before the Middle Ages, where an incredible anomaly occurred, where civilizations, dynasties representing the Jewish, the Christian, the Muslim faiths all found a cohesive ecumenical alliance, a series of very creative, very high-level diplomatic arrangements that nearly created a completely new paradigm in world affairs which was artificially sabotaged by the remnants of that Roman Empire, which at that time took on the form of the Byzantine Empire, the key leading families of Rome, when it wasn't an oligarchy centered on the control of, like I said, banking, money, mystery religions, oracles like at Delphi in Greece. But you had basically a structure of control, not that dissimilar from what we're living through today, though obviously taking the form it did in its time, run by a series of bloodlines of families. And many of these families did disintegrate in the West. In the East, they continued in the Byzantium Empire. You had the rise of the Venetian Empire, where other families made their escape and set up a new sort of foundation for a new empire in the 5th century. And you had always attempts to artificially create wars between faiths. Mm-hmm. This is something which, here, let me actually turn into a perfect slideshow here. Let me ask, can people see the PowerPoint in front of them right now?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yes.
All right. All right, so before I get into this, there's 4 lessons about historical method that I wanted to just convey. So there's 2 do-nots and 2 do's that fly in the face of the standard teaching of historiography as it's taught in modern universities. So basically the way it's taught is the very opposite of what you should be doing if you want to discover anything causal about our world in a way which is actually useful for problem solving the crises that our current world might find itself in. So what I write here, the first lesson here is that history is not about discussing anything without context. Context is everything. So a lot of people will try to say, well, I've got my PhD in ancient, Greek history. That's my thing. That's my shtick. I can lecture, write books about that. Or I like the, 19th century Austro-Hungarian imperial period. That's my shtick. But this is all completely incompetent, because each time you try to talk about a place and make that your specialization, your field that you know everything about, without understanding the guiding principles of the context of the world as a whole and what's shaping that first in your mind, then there's always going to be fallacies and things that you're going to miss out completely, because just like no human being is an island, no nation is an island either. Everything is built by a dynamic context. Number 2, history is not about the past. This is a bit paradoxical for many people to hear, because they think of history and they think of what happened in the past. I would say, and I think the best historians that I respect would say, history is never about the past. It's ultimately about understanding the principles that shape the past, yes, and you have to know about dates and events, but it's ultimately about the future. It's an active process. It's not passively here in the future safe looking at this thing called past in order to write about it or describe it like some anatomist. It's a living process, and we are living in history. So in the future, which is going to happen, whether we like it or not, people will be looking upon our day and age and the individual within it as part of their history research. So history is best shaped by people who are thinking about the future, okay? And an investigation of that history can't be done without a sense of the future, of our future, as well as the future that should have been, that people were planning for, but perhaps it didn't come to pass. Why? The other thing that I want to say is that history is thus about ideas primarily. So yes, there are material events in time and in space that happen, but the thing that causes them can't be found within the sequence of events in time and space. There's always something metaphysical, as Augustine was developing last week, or 1,500 years ago, but as Aaron was developing upon Augustine's ideas last week. History is really shaped by a battle of ideas, and some ideas put into action are founded upon truthfulness, natural law, creative reason that's in harmony with the laws of mankind and nature. And certain ideas are just completely out of harmony. They're out of whack. They're lies. And there are certain measurable, relatively measurable effects when you put a line into operation for a little bit too long, as we could see with maybe, you know, a metaphor of a bird that's convinced it's a fish. It's a wrong idea, but it might live for the next, you know, few minutes thinking it's a fish, but after a couple hours, that bird is going to be floating. It's sort of like that with humans. You know, if you get human beings to organize our existence around the idea that we're just talking monkeys, maybe a little bit, you know, whatever you want to, if we're just some monkey with purely material bestial expressions and passions as our identity, then yeah, you might find that humanity will exist, civilization will continue, but there will be a markedly diminished capacity for creative, loving thought on the large scale as well as in the small scale, as that society heads towards crises that shouldn't have ever been there to begin with. And if that society is not able to break out of those wrong ideas, as Augustine tried to help the Roman Empire do in its time, but if it continues on its imperial concepts, then it will ultimately disintegrate. It will go into a dark age. If it can be avoided, if better ideas can win the day, you can avoid the dark age. You can get a renaissance. And the last thing I want to just say here is that history, as we will come to look at in the next hour or so, is really best examined through anomalies, outliers, the exceptions to the rule. It's not very useful to look at history by looking at the normative data, the things, the consensus opinions that people believe about a nation's mythologies or people. That's not going to get you anywhere if you want to really make a discovery. It might give you, you know, respect or a grant if you want to, you know, have a book or a research project, but it's not going to really help you make a discovery. So the anomalies are really what you want to hang on to and hold them in the mind a lot, which brings me to one of the best historians who was a great help in the course of this composition. I would just say there's a few people that I used. I want to really just state that a lot of the research was made possible by a lot of the pioneering work of a historian who had been a former teacher at the University of Montreal. He's based out of the United States. He's in his 70s now, named Pierre Baudry, who did work, a lot of, like I said, pioneering work on Charlemagne and this ecumenical alliance of cultures. His work brought me to the attention of many other authors that I found to have great value, one of whom was not ancient, but a 10th century scholar, a geographer, a historian, a poet, and a scientist named Al-Mazudi. That's a picture of him there on the right, if people can see.
I can't see.
You can't see this because the people's. Here, let me do this. Okay, so that's a picture of Al-Mazudi. Now, Al-Mazudi, in his Meadows of Gold, which is one of the few documents that describe the Khazar Empire in detail, and a lot more. He writes and gives a little bit of advice to future historians, where he says, now, he who has never left his hearth and has confined his researches to the narrow field of the history of his own country cannot be compared to the courageous traveler who has worn out his life in journeys of exploration to distant parts, and each day has faced danger in order to persevere in excavating the mines of learning and in snatching precious fragments of the past from oblivion. I think that is a wonderful little way to start our presentation. Because the 200-year period I want to look at was sort of the culmination of the spirit of Augustine. Augustine died in 430 AD, watching a society slowly disintegrate. It really was the collapse of an empire that had endured for a very long time. The Roman Empire had been about a 500-year empire, but the Republic beforehand existed for several hundred years, and the kingdoms before that. So we're talking about well over 1,000-year civilization of Rome had come to an end. Yeah. Augustine died without seeing the culmination, the fulfillment of a lot of his ideas, which he fought day and night for. However, over the course of the 200 years after he died, a network of his followers and collaborators created things like the Irish monastery movement. So they were able to take the best Platonic humanist traditions of Christianity and bring them to Ireland outside of the corruption, the wars, and the decay of Europe, whereby a real hotbed for learning was created, and morality, whereby one of Augustine's key doctrines was the doctrine of work, that the priests and the monks must always do work. They cannot simply live in entitlement while the serfs provide their meals. So that was one of the key things that he fought for, the idea of researching the classics, ancient Greek, ancient Roman, and other stories, translating them, transcribing them. This gave birth to the process that we know of as the Book of Kells, right? So you had this, people like St. Patrick were part of that. We had a lot of people who later on worked very hard over generations to establish what we see there on your left is Charlemagne, and Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, whose name might not be noble, but he was a great man who set up the Carolingian dynasty, using Augustinian teaching principles of teaching orphans, teaching the young, don't just leave education for the elite. Internal improvements, that the idea of a king or a prince was that their legitimacy derived not from just being in the right family, but being an instrument of God's will as a servant of the people. And he would do that by putting his treasuries not towards war, but towards internal improvements, which we saw again with the cathedral building, the canals, the roads, the schools that were built en masse under Charlemagne's father and Charlemagne. On the right, we see a picture of Harun al-Rashid, who was the caliph of the Abbasid dynasty from 786 to 809, who was a close friend of Charlemagne and had a very interesting alliance. It was under him and his father that we had experienced his father was Al-Mahdi and his grandfather was Al-Mansur, who all created the Abbasid dynasty was the foundation of what's called the Islamic Golden Renaissance. Very similar principles of reforms and a real prize of astronomy, of science, of mathematics. Things like Al-Khwarizmi came out of this, medicine. So the idea that you learn God's mind guided by the principles of your holy book, of your Bible, of your Quran, but primarily, number one, guided by the pursuit of natural law, the book of nature. And so we prove that by cultivating what God gave us, our consciences and our minds, our reason to make discoveries and to share that. Poetry was also a big one in both kingdoms. So with that appreciation for the more subtle but more important aspect of humanity, made in the image of God, which again, Augustine was all about the idea of man is made in the living image of a creative God, a God that is not a dead, stagnant God that just created his creation and then stopped being creative. It's an active process. So that idea was what really animated these guys. On the third figure that you see is an image of a figure known as King Bulan, who's someone who's almost entirely been written out of history, who ran the Khazar kingdom for a very large period of the 8th and 9th centuries, overlapping the lives of Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid. The Khazar kingdom will be a very fascinating part of our journey today. This is a Jewish kingdom, and it's a complete anomaly. It's an anomaly because there's so little known of it, in spite of the fact that it played a very instrumental role in world history for a sustained period. It's incredible just how little written material has survived the sands of time. It's quite extraordinary, and it does imply that there was a systematic effort over many years to destroy all our recollections of what this is. And it's only really in the late 19th century that you have things like the Egyptian Genitza, where 10,000 Jewish scrolls were found, most of them hailing from Khazaria, that have only recently started becoming made public, where we're starting to see more empirical data and evidence. Otherwise, we just have things like historians of the 10th and 11th centuries, like, I mentioned the Meadows of Gold. We have people like Judah Halevi, but we don't have a lot. So this is one facet we're going to explore. And then on the very right, we have the Taizong Emperor of the Tang Dynasty. The Taizong Emperor reigned from 626 to 649. And the anomaly here in these four figures is that the Taizong far precedes the other three on the left. his timeline doesn't quite fit with the period that I'm really fascinated by, but it's vital. Understanding the Tang Dynasty and specifically what this emperor did as one of the founding emperors is vital to understand the paradoxes and the anomalies of this whole ecumenical alliance. The other thing here that's also important just to say, I mentioned that history is not about the past. Well, by looking at this alliance of cultures throughout the 7th to the 9th century especially, we could see that there is something very, very important that we can learn about the dynamics shaping our current future, which has arisen since the 2013 Belt and Road Initiative was launched by the Chinese government. There's a brief, very simplified map of the Belt and Road Initiative, otherwise known as the New Silk Road, that Xi Jinping announced as China's national policy and international policy in 2013. It has evolved in ways that nobody thought were possible just a few years ago to spread throughout Africa, building, the biggest development projects in world history are now occurring in Africa, across Asia, reconstruction plans for Syria, Iraq, the Middle East, Iran, moving through Turkey and into Europe. We have networks as well that are not featured on this map moving through Russia, what's called the Steppe Silk Road of ancient times. And we have a maritime Silk Road going through the waters that we're seeing from the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, all the way through to the Atlantic, ultimately by way of the Mediterranean. This is something which is huge. The principles organizing this system are in diametric opposition to the unipolar globalist model of the British Empire, which has been dominating Canada, the US, and Europe now for far too long. And that is a system which is based on a paradigm of man as a beast to be ruled by the alpha beasts. And that system is ultimately collapsing here at an accelerating rate. So we have two systems vying right now for leadership. The multipolar model, which you see in front of your eyes, where sovereign nation states, sovereign cultures are respected, their differences are respected, while a common unity of common need and principle is the focus of diplomatic and economic discourse, versus the unipolar model of what we've been living under NATO, the world banking systems, the City of London, that really just say divide to conquer. That there is one law, but there can be only one rule, one principle, but that principle is the rule of the stronger over the weaker. And the weaker, according to any Hobbesian, must be made stupid and inclined to fight other weak victims over differences, whether it's differences in geography or differences in religion. I'm just gonna move to the next one here. We're just letting in, okay. So this is obviously a revival of an ancient process. This didn't come out of 2013 China. This came out of a revival of an ancient tradition, which has been the primary driver of human culture. All upshifts and positive influences in human civilization happened not through divide to conquer, but rather through unifying to thrive. So there's two different principles of organizing society. The Silk Road, and this is the Han Dynasty snapshot of the Silk Road, which I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail. This is something which defined the world for hundreds of years. And it was really only with the Mongol destruction of of Baghdad, the destruction of China, that was largely being waged and manipulated by the Venetian Empire in the 13th century, which is a whole other story. That collapsed, the Silk Road process. But this is what's being revived now 800 years later, after many thought it was gone forever. What we're seeing there are several different trading networks moving from China all the way through Europe. This is during the existence still of the Byzantium Empire. We're not seeing the sea-based trade, but one of the key trade routes here is the Steppe Silk Road, moving not through the Middle East, but rather through Central Asian, Russian territory to the Ukraine zone. We're going to look a little bit more at this. So, okay, so let's take another look at this. So just to get a scope, keeping in mind the context idea, right? That you can't look at any one part of the world out of context. So looking at the period of around the 1st century AD, which amounted to the maximum height of Roman influence of the empire, you have several empires, several civilizations coexisting. The biggest ones here being the Han Empire, which was set up around 200 BC. The Silk Road was created in 138 BC and endured until the collapse of the Han Dynasty. The Han Dynasty collapsed around 220. We're going to go into that a little bit more. And we have, again, we could see the motion of trade of not just silk, but I mean, and not just spices, but we have finished goods, pottery, techniques, pottery ware, different technologies for windmills, paper, other things, as well as cultural traditions, aesthetical practices in tiling, mosaic work, painting, musical forms, philosophies. Were constantly cross-pollinating east to west. This didn't come out of the Venetian Marco Polo as the first sort of innovator to go from the west to the east. This was a long-term thing. What we have there is the Kushan Empire. We have the Parthian Empire. The Parthian being something that happened, that was a big empire after the collapse of Alexander's empire and the, I want to say Sassanid Empire, but I think it's got a different name, not Sassanid. Forgetting it all of a sudden, I'm sorry. But basically after the collapse of what Alexander the Great had created by spreading all the way to India, you had the establishment of what's called the Parthian Empire, which was relatively, it was an interesting zone, but it was a core point of flow of the Silk Road goods to Europe from China and then back to China. It was known for ecumenicism, and this whole region was always known for tolerance of different faiths. So you had Christians, you had Jews, you had Islam didn't exist yet, but you had Zoroastrians, you had Manichaeans, many others all coexisting in relative harmony within the Parthian Empire. I wouldn't say that it's a model of morality, but it's still interesting that you had that. And that was about a 400-year duration between 247 BC and 224. We have the, oh, someone's trying to enter this meeting here, sorry. Okay. We have the Kushan Empire, which overlaps big chunks of today's Pakistan, India, Afghanistan. This also ties into a lot of the influence here was set by Bactria, the Greco-Indian civilization that brought in a lot of the Greek studies of the golden section, statuary, and other things into Asia. Things like Mahayana Buddhism came out of this process. And we have other kingdoms in Africa too at the time. We won't go through that, but just to give people a sense, right, of the global process and the key trade routes. So, sorry, I'm having a little trouble. So jumping back to the world that Augustine was living in, the empire had lost a big chunk of influence around the time that that the Silk Road, that the Han Dynasty collapsed. So first what we had is the collapse of the Han Dynasty in 220. And with the collapse of the Han, which was really the driver of the Silk Road process, the Silk Road dynamic took a big hit. We're talking like 80% destruction of the trade routes from China to Europe. That was a big force stabilizing the economy too, was that constant flow of goods from China. And throughout, you know, along the way from Central Asia, Arabia, and Africa. So at a certain point, a little bit after the Han Dynasty collapses, we have in 285 here, the division of the Roman Empire, which Diocletian makes when it becomes real. He realized that it's impossible to sustain this empire. It's too big, too bulky, too unwieldy, and it can't be run by one top-down figure anymore. So he breaks it up into an east, which later becomes the Byzantium Empire, with Thessalonica as a temporary home and capital. It changes later on. And then you have the Holy Roman Empire, where that becomes the Holy Roman Empire later. But Rome is defined by the Roman Catholic Church. It's now the West and the East. In jumping back to China, you have here a 350-year process of hell, of just chaos, internal wars, strife, and as this image makes the point, over 30 local dynasties rose and fell over simply 350 years. This is after 400 years of stability and prosperity under the Huns, which were defined, again, around Confucian ideals, the idea of the mandate of heaven, which is similar to what we talked about with Charlemagne and as well as Harun al-Rashid, that it's not your bloodline that defines your legitimacy to rule, but are you following the laws of heaven? Because if you as a leader disobey the laws of heaven, the laws of morality, then you lose the right, the authority that you enjoy to rule over your nation. That Confucian principle was key. That was lost during this period where it was basically might makes right. And whoever could come out on top for that small period without getting stabbed in the back did. But that was just backstabs for 350 years. Let's jump back now to, so jumping back to the area that we had known as the Roman Empire. This is now the 6th century, the 500s. It really went to hell. You know, I described how we had the 410 sacking by the Visigoths. We had the 455 Vandals, which sacked Rome again, from which it never recovered. There was an attempt by Romulus Augustus to sort of save the empire. That didn't work. He was deposed, and Germanic pagan shamanistic tribes took over. It was a lot of local baronials. It was like a balkanization, but one where everybody was just fighting everybody, just like we had going on in China around the same period. And it was really a dark age. So plagues, wars, mass death, despair, not a lot of hope. But in the midst of this, you did have a concerted effort by, like I said, the Augustinian faction, which established itself in the kingdom of the Franks. We're going to say a little bit more about that. I'm trying to see here if there's anything else important to say about this map. Not vital, not vital. Okay, so what happened? In around the 6th century, you had the Merovingian Empire was a Frankish, it was part of the kingdom of the Franks that had turned, or at least the leader of it had turned Christian, Clovis the First. But there really wasn't a lot of a sense, it was still governed by this idea that the people living in this world who had believed other faiths their entire lives and their parents and grandparents, they're just going to convert to whatever religion we politically impose on them. That didn't work very well. There was not a lot of sense of why are we doing this from the people, and a lot of dissatisfaction. There was also not a lot of a sense, there wasn't much of a sense under the Merovingians of internal improvements, of education, of science. It was not a big appreciation. So that was doomed to sort of collapse. However, I brought up Charlemagne. Charlemagne's father was the first of the first emperor who founded the Carolingian Empire. In orange, that's really what we're looking at here. That became the biggest dynasty of Europe since the collapse of the Roman Empire. Basically today, where we have all of these different European countries, we didn't have that. It was really just one Carolingian dynasty. Below that, you had the Emirate of Cordoba, which was the Umayyad Muslim empire. I'm going to say a little something about that afterwards. That gave birth later on to the Andalusian Renaissance. We still have the Byzantine Empire, and we still have a lot of other groups like Western Slavs, Bulgars, and Eastern Slavs. The Abbasids here have come to power. And okay, now what I want to do quickly is just show one other thing to jump back to China. Here we are. Okay, this is a short video. It's 2 minutes of China. It's one of these fun animated maps of China. I'm not going to play the whole thing. I'm only going to play the first few seconds, or maybe the first 1 minute, perhaps, just to give people a view of the process in motion. I really like these animations. God, sound, we can avoid the sound. So starting from the creation of the Han Dynasty, we have the Han growing. And this is what we saw in that map around the 1st century, connecting to Rome. We have certain destabilizations, but overall the general tendency is towards growth. Then we have this breakup period that I went through, right? So we have now just the warring factions, not a lot of unity. Silk Road is collapsing. All right, now we're at 421, 440. more faction fights, more gangs, counter gangs. Okay. All right. So now we have something interesting happen. We have the Tang Dynasty. And the Taizong Emperor, who I showed at the very beginning, is the one of the earliest leaders of the Tang Dynasty. Here we have a return to the Confucian principles of social organization for the first time in 400 years. And we have a renewal of the Silk Road and also a renewal of tolerance. One of the things that the Taizong Emperor did is he welcomed other cultures from around the world for the first time in the most embracing way. So you had all of a sudden in 618, the first influx of Jews. Islam was not a major thing yet, but you had Zoroastrians, you had Nestorian Christians who show up in the Tang Dynasty in great numbers. Early Christian churches, Nestorian Christian churches show up there. It's a very vibrant process, but you also have judiciary reforms. So the Taizong Emperor overhauls the legal system and gets rid of things like the death penalty, except for the most extreme of cases. Now, the death penalty had been used, as one can imagine, in a time of where gangs are running the world very liberally, and you didn't have to do very much to get your head chopped off. So not only did he infuse principles of compassion, of tolerance, of really loving your neighbor in so many ways, because you were giving people education, you were doing internal improvements through infrastructure, water projects. All of this stuff was very important. Let's jump ahead a couple more years. Okay, that's a big one. So something happens. Something happens and the Tang Dynasty gets a lot bigger. What is really going on there? This is gonna play into the mystery of Khazaria a little bit, okay? I'm not gonna necessarily give away all my answers at the same time, but I want people just to see certain things and hold them in their mind. Maybe I'll just play a little bit more just to, okay. Let's just stop in the mid 700s. Okay, then we have a collapse. Okay. All right, so let's go back to there. So the Tang Dynasty for many decades here gets a lot bigger. Now, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Sorry, it's doing a little bit of a lag here. Oh, shoot. All right. So what do we have here is the, the Tang Dynasty just got a lot bigger. We have a revival of the Silk Road now. I looked at Europe, I looked at the collapse of Rome, some of the fights, the creation of the Carolingian Empire, which we sort of see there in pink. But I didn't really look at the Middle East, Africa, the Persian world, the Arabic world. So after Islam is created, it's a real revolution. The Sassanid Empire, which had, that whole area where we had the Parthian Empire, which was sort of this whole zone here. Mm-hmm. That then disappears in 227 or 224, and it becomes the Sassanid Empire. Again, it's a pagan, generally a pagan empire, but still renowned for religious tolerance, and still values. It still values learning. There's still a lot of centers of education. Those are good things. And the Silk Road is still moving through. So it is still a gateway from East-West cultures and trade, but it's not that enduring. Mm-hmm. The Sassanid Empire ends up melting down in 640 or so AD, or Common Era, I should say, just to be more ecumenical here. What replaces it is the Umayyad Empire, which is what we see. So this is the Umayyad Caliphate, which is the second caliphate of Islam. Hold on one second. One person cannot see my slides. Can other people see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, some can, some can't. Okay, let me do something here. I'm gonna end my screen share and I'm gonna reshare it from scratch. 1 second. Start share. Okay, can people see the slides better now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
now it's the new slide.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm super sorry. Were people able to see the animation of China?
Yes.
Oh, good. All right, fantastic. All right, so let me get to the slideshow again. All right, so we have here the Umayyads, which extend all the way to Spain, through North Africa, much of Persia, Arabia. I mean, this is a big empire, and it endures for quite some time, until 751. Actually, it endures. It interfaces with the Byzantine Empire. It interfaces with Charlemagne's world and Pepin's world, and it interfaces with Asia, with India, and with China. But it's overthrown, and a competing empire or dynasty is created. Empire dynasty, it's kind of interchangeable sometimes, called the Abbasids. Now, the Abbasids are, like I said earlier at the beginning, this is the roots in many ways. This is at least given credit as being the heart of the Islamic Renaissance. Assad, when he gives his presentation, is probably going to go into much more clarity and detail than I'm going to go into. I'm going to keep it a little bit more vague and broad for my presentation. The Umayyads continue to control pretty much the territory of Spain, but beyond that, nothing in this zone is Umayyad anymore. The Abbasids claim their descendancy from one of the grandfathers of Muhammad. Kwan later on can probably correct me, or Assad, about the Umayyads. I'm not too sure where they claim their descendancy from. But as we see from these zones of trade again, by this time the Silk Road is back up and running, and things are moving very, very well through Africa, Europe, all the way. And this zone is vital. They don't communicate very much in a lot of these graphs, the importance of the Steppe Silk Road going through Russia. Some graphs do, this one doesn't, only does a little bit over here. That'll be an important part of the story of Khazaria as well. Why? Because obviously if you look at where Khazaria is located, it's straight through the Steppe Silk Road. These are some of the trade routes that go from Khwarezm all the way through Khazaria. This is the evolution of it from its earliest points in the early 600s. Before it was Jewish, it was set up originally as a shamanistic Turkish kingdom. It was a lot smaller at the beginning, and it grew and grew until about 850 is the longest expansion period where it owns much of Crimea, all the way down around the Black Sea, Caspian, and much of Russia. So this is a very important zone. It is, and again, right down here we have the Persian area, the Abbasid Caliphates. Byzantine is still there. And it's very hard to find this thing on a lot of maps even. I mean, if you look at it, people often producing a lot of historical maps just tend to white it out as if it didn't even exist.
Really?
Yeah, it's really strange. So not only are the empirical letters, the writings, the laws, I mean, we have some inscriptions that have been maintained, but so much has been destroyed on that level, but also on the maps, people find it very comfortable to just ignore it. There's another point of irony, of an anomaly about this zone, which is that, oh, Kwan just sent an answer to where the Umayyads come from. Can you read what that is? I can't see it on my computer. Can you read it? I don't know. Okay. Kwan, just quick, jump right in, because I can't read for some reason the messages that I'm given by written form. So just take yourself off of mute and just say quickly, where did the Umayyads come from? And I'll get back on to Khazaria.
Yeah, the Umayyads are cousins of the Prophet. They are much, much more powerful and far richer than the Prophet. The Prophet comes from a distinguished but impoverished family of the Quraysh.
I see. Okay, thank you. Okay, so yeah, they were kicked out. They had to go to Spain. That's pretty much the only place that they could keep their bastion of power alive for a bit longer. but okay, we have Khazaria. So the point I was going to get at is that for those scholars who have looked at Khazaria and recognized its importance, they all there's a general consensus that even though it's a shamanistic religion as a dominant philosophy, there are Christians, there are Jews, there are Muslims who live there. They make the point, though, that it is highly influenced by Confucianism and specifically the principle of the mandate of heaven. That's pretty much across the board. Also, some Hindu philosophy is very much influencing the Khazarian governing worldview, which are just, again, interesting things, right? So where did Khazaria come from? How did this Turkish kingdom, how is that set up? Why did it convert to Judaism a little bit later on? Because this is still, this is set up in the early 600s. It only converted to Judaism in 750 or so, late 750s. Why? So here we go. Try to get the whole map here. Again, in a lot of maps dealing with the age of empires and the evolution of empires and dynasties, it's not as often as one would expect to see the existence of the Göktürk Empire. It's an extraordinarily huge empire that stretches all the way from Mongolia, from China, all the way across the Middle East, Central Asia, into, like, its influence spreads all the way to Crimea. I mean, it's incredible, to Ukraine, to big chunks of Russia. It's huge. It never had really a common leader. It was always a system organized by tribes. It was shamanistic. It ran for a couple hundred years, and it was so it never had a centralized authority in the typical way we would define that in the West or even in the East. But it was a huge influencer, and it ran most of the Silk Road trade routes throughout that dark period of the 400s, 500s, 600s. It was the primary dominant force running Silk Road trade routes in culture, east to west. But we still see here, this expression is at its maximum force. So keep that in your mind. All right, there's some key dates I want us to look at. So I mentioned here already, 618, Tang Dynasty is founded, Silk Road Renaissance, influx of Jews, and a big toleration for other cultures in China. Now, again, nothing's peachy keen and perfect always. I'm saying that you have these anomalies. It's not to say that bad things didn't happen in all of these places. So I'm not trying to be a utopian idealist here, but there is a specific principle that's consistent being acted upon, which the empire has worked to obstruct and destroy when it was happening, and our memory and our ability to research it many years in the future. That's important just to keep in mind. So remember that big growth of the Tang Dynasty's territories. So 643 was a period where you have the Eastern Turkish Khaganate, which, I mean, the Göktürk Empire breaks up into an East and a West structure. The Eastern part picks a fight with the Taigan emperor and loses big, very big in 643, to the point that you have a massive expansion of China's territory, taking over much of the Eastern Göktürk Empire. And also what's interesting is that for over 100 years, the Chinese emperor becomes the, what's the name of this? It's the Tengri Khagan. So the heavenly king of the Göktürk Empire becomes the Chinese emperor. And letters that we have found all the way to 748 to the emperor from different, I don't know if they were called beys in those days, but different leaders of the Turkic tribes, we're still referring to him as the Tengri emperor, the Tengri Khagan, which is just fascinating that the head of China was also the head of the Göktürks, of at least a big chunk of them. The Western Gokturk Emperor was then free. It had a lot more liberty and freedom to do its own thing in many ways without the same procedures as before. Around the same time, you had 100,000 Turks migrate to China. 10,000 of the intelligentsia, the leaders of the Gokturk Empire, all moved permanently to the Chinese capital. Now, this is 643. And so with that, you have the infusion. It's not just the defeat of the Gokturks. What you have is an assimilation in many ways of the principles of Confucianism, and it's polarizing. Wherever, all the way through to the West Coast, or the Western part, you have Confucian principles now being spread, being passed on, the philosophies being communicated, and organizational structures around this idea are being set up. The other thing is the other dates I want to keep in mind here, very strong dates, moments of singularity, pregnant moments as some might call them, occur in 750. Because in 750, you have the Abbasid dynasty, which is founded. In 751, you have the Carolingian Empire dynasty that is also founded. So the Merovingians are overthrown, Carolingians set up, and they unify a very, very compartmentalized, broken up Europe. In 752 to 59, we don't have the concrete dates exactly, but it's speculated that around that time is when King Bulan of Khazaria chose to convert to Judaism while he was in Baghdad. And again, the fact that he is in Baghdad, part of the Abbasid dynasty, where he converts to Judaism is interesting. This is documented by Judah Halevi, as well as Masudi, al-Masudi. There's a couple of others who have also documented this who were not contemporaries, but close enough. Now, he doesn't demand that everybody in his kingdom become Jewish. That's important as well. Similarly, the Abbasid dynasty nor the Christian Carolingian Empire ever demanded that everybody in their kingdom become Christian or Muslim. Also very important concepts that people like Samuel P. Huntington would choose to ignore when he builds his thesis, Clash of Civilisations. I also include here a few other things here. 751, as Charlemagne's father sets up the Carolingian Empire, he also takes a big, important part of Spain away from the Umayyad Caliphate called Septimania, which we'll look at a little bit more, which is a key entry point. It has the key ports where Silk Road goods come in, as well as goods from Arabia and Africa. On the, we have the Jewish Radhanite Trading Company is founded, centered in Narbonne, France. That happens in 751 as well. Now, there are two major trading companies that have a near monopoly over the trade over the Steppe Silk Road and other trade routes in the West. You have the Kiev Rus Trading Company, and you have the Jewish Radhanite Trading Company. There's some speculation about the word Radan, where they originate from. We're going to see a little bit more about that. Even though they're based in Narbonne, which is the center of Septimania, and it's where the biggest port exists, also some of the biggest educational centers. It becomes a hotbed for what later becomes the Islamic Renaissance of Spain, of Andalusia, which is a little bit further south. But in spite of that, we don't know where exactly they came from. Radan, the best theory I've seen so far is that Radan being a place in Baghdad, which was a cultural hotbed, a center of the Arab Renaissance. They got their name from that zone. That's possible. It's likely, but not proven. Unfortunately, while all of these positive developments are going on with like-minded thinkers who are creating common alliances, instead of going to war with each other, which is what forces within the Byzantine, Venetian Empire, within the Ultramontane Church as well were working towards, they were all working on trade philosophy, dialogue, and diplomatic cooperation. So all this is happening. Why is China not participating so much in this process? And this is the unfortunate situation of the 755 Anxi rebellion, which nearly destroyed the Tang dynasty very early on. And I wrote here, it was saved by Caliph al-Mahdi, the father of Harun al-Rashid, who was the first to sort of really put this policy into motion. How did he do it? Well, even though the Abbasid dynasty had gotten into a war in 751 with China, when they made the choice to ally themselves with the Tibetans. The Tibetan Empire was its own dynasty at the time. And it allied with the Abbasids in order to fight the Tang. That didn't end so well. And a couple of years later, the person who was responsible for siding with the Tibetans, who was the father of al-Mahdi, dies, and al-Mahdi ends up creating this new alliance with China, possibly to make amends. I don't know. Oh, I said al-Mahdi. I'm sorry. It was al-Mansur. Al-Mansur is the grandfather of Harun al-Rashid. I'm sorry for the name dropping here, but it was not al-Mahdi, al-Mansur, who was the first caliph of the Abbasids. So how does he save the Chinese dynasty? Well, he sends 4,000 Chinese soldiers to fight as an elite guard for the Tang dynasty against a general who chose to make himself emperor of the north of China. And instead of allowing this dissolution to occur, they fought this general. It lasted for about a year or two. But if it weren't for the Muslim soldiers, this wouldn't have been a success. They were the decisive factor in that battle. And the fact that afterwards, the majority of these soldiers decided to settle in China, this is where the first mosques in China are known to have arisen. So that's an interesting other part of the lesser known history of China. Now, we have the Gok Turks, we have the infusion of Confucian principles, mandate of heaven. We have the setup of part of the Western Gok Turks that created the Khazaria Empire. The Radhanite Traders are vital to this whole process. I think, again, a lot of misinformation has been written, but for about 80 to 100 years, the Radhanite Traders were the most dominant force managing the trade, and it was those same years that started with the 750, right? The creation of this whole alliance of Carolingian Abbasid structures and alliances with China through the Abbasids. And who are the traders? Who are the Radhanites? Let me see if I can get the. All right. So I'm going to try to do this in a way where everyone can see. So this is a 1978 scholar who just wrote something good. I'm going to mostly use contemporaries for my my quotes about things, but in this case, it's a good piece of work that he did on the Khazar Kingdom's conversion to Judaism, produced by Harvard Ukrainian Studies in 1978. His name is Omelian Pritsak. So the citation describing the Radhans is the Radhania discovered Eastern Europe as commercial base shortly after 750, and as numismatic data have confirmed, their activity continues until the 830s. It is clear why the Radhania were the first traders to enter Eastern Europe. With the division of the Mare Nostrum between them about 660, neither Muslims nor Christians could travel and trade freely on the sea, since they were in continuous state of war. Only former Roman subjects of Jewish faith could travel without danger from Marseille to Kairouan, North Africa, and from there to Constantinople. So here we go. You know, there were from 660 protocols in place that pretty much defined a state of constant war between Christian and Muslim worlds. It didn't mean that there was always war happening, but that it's kind of like, you know, you can imagine Japan and Russia, right? They're still in technically a state of war, except it's a lot more aggressive. There was more occurrences of conflict throughout this entire period, which made it very dangerous and near impossible for traders of either faith to move through the other's territories without fear of being, basically getting their head cut off or getting caught in a conflict. So that type of chaos made dialogue between civilizations very difficult. So you can see the advantage. I mean, the author here is getting at what was the geopolitical advantage for these traders being Jewish. There wasn't a lot of that same baggage. Of course, Jews suffered a lot of problems under the Byzantine and under Western Roman churches, but it was in no way similar. There was no constant state of war in any way similar. Just to make it a little bit easier to see visually. Thank you so much. Can you do it, Allison? All right. So just to showcase here, in blue are the trade routes run by the Radhanites. So we have here a lot of blue, both over sea as well as over land on many passages, especially going through Khazaria. That's the biggest passage right now. And the reason why Khazaria, what was called the Steppe Silk Road, is so attractive is because you get to avoid all of the religious confrontation and fights that were constantly being waged in the Middle East, in Europe, and internal fights and discord as well. So you got to avoid all of that. And it took like 40 days longer to do this, but the security on your goods was so much greater, not having to go through that crap. So it was a vital entry point through Khazaria, I would say a keystone, all the way to the Frankish area. But again, just to appreciate the array of trade routes that the Radhanites controlled, who could speak all of these languages, is just fascinating. Did they have something to do with the choice of the Khazars of King Bulan to establish Judaism as the court religion in Khazaria? Did he not want to get enmeshed into these imperial wars between Islam and Christianity? I would say that that's probably at least one of the very important factors. I wouldn't say it's all just practical. I don't want to reduce a choice in religion to something that's purely practical, but I think that you can't discount the geopolitical usefulness of this decision as well. So again, Al-Masudi, okay? We cited him at the very beginning of our lecture. Is that somebody trying to communicate with me? Okay. So Al-Masudi says, in describing Khazaria, and again, he's one of the few scholars who really went in depth into Khazaria, he writes that the predominant element in this country, Khazar, are the Muslims. All right, just fixing up something here. Thank you. Are the Muslims. So remember how the Muslims saved the Tang dynasty in 954. They saved the Tang dynasty by devoting their elite guard to China. So it wasn't just for the Chinese that they had this diplomatic approach. He says here that the predominant element in this country, Khazar, are the Muslims because they form the royal army. They are known in this country as Arsia and are immigrants from the neighborhood of Khwarizmi. Long ago, after the appearance of Islam, there was war and pestilence in their country, and they repaired to the Khazar king. They are strong and courageous, and the Khazar king relies on them in his wars. They have continued to reside in his country on certain conditions, one being the open profession of their religion, Islam, with permission from mosques and the call to prayer. Further, the vizierate must belong to them. At present, the vizier is one of them, Ahmed ibn Quya. This is probably now the late 10th century that he's referring to, but this dynamic is consistent throughout the entire period of the 250 years that we're talking about. When the king of the Khazars is at war with the Muslims, so it did happen, right? That Khazaria did end up at times going to war with the Muslims. They have a separate place in his army and do not fight the people of their own faith. They fight with him against all the unbelievers. At such times, about 7,000 of them ride with the king, archers with breastplates, helmets, and coats of mail. Some are lancers equipped and armed like the Muslim. They also have Muslim judges, Qudat. The custom in the Khazar capital is to have 7 judges. Of these, 2 are for the Muslims. 2 are for the Khazars judging according to the Torah. 2 are for those among them who are Christians, judging according to the gospel. And 1 for the Sakilabeh, Rus, and other pagans judging according to pagan law, i.e. theoretical principles. They do not worship God, nor do they have recourse to reason. That's the pagans. When a serious case is brought up, of which they have no knowledge, they come before the Muslim judges and plead there, obeying what the law of Islam lays down. None of the kings of the East in this quarter has a regularly provisioned army except the king of the Khazars. All the Muslims in those parts are known by the name of these people, the Arsiya, and the Rus and Sakaliba, whom we have mentioned as pagans. They are the army and servitors of the king. In his city are many Muslims, merchants, and craftsmen, besides the Arsiya, who have come to his country because of his justice and security which he offers. They have a cathedral mosque and minarets which rise above the royal castle, and other mosques there besides, with schools where the children learn the Quran. If the Muslims and Christians are agreed, the king cannot cope with them. So yeah, like even the king is forced to obey a situation where you have ecumenical agreement by the leaders of the Muslim and the Christian faith. So this is, again, just a very, very fascinating arrangement. And, you know, think about the current situation in the Middle East today, which everyone deems to be hopeless and not even worth even attempting to problem solve, because it's so much of a mess between Israel and Palestine and the Muslims and the Jews in general. You can imagine what a type of diplomatic maneuver it would be if Israel should at any point come out and say that all of a sudden a big part of their army would be made of Muslims who would defend Israel, right? Under the condition that, I mean, it's just incredible to think of what a creative and maneuver that is, but also what a mark of faith and trust that is. It's certainly not something you would do if you were just purely a practical, you know, utilitarian thinker. You wouldn't be able to think that way, but it works. Now, it's not just Jews and Muslims, because this is a painting from the 19th century featuring a rendition of Harun al-Rashid sitting at his throne in, I think at that time it was Baghdad, but it might have been Syria. And he's welcoming a diplomatic mission from Charlemagne over there, talking to him as a man with a cross leading that mission, or at least an ambassador of that mission with a monk behind. This is an account of something that really did happen, and something which happened many times, really, because as soon as Charlemagne came to power, he accelerated diplomatic missions to the Abbasids enormously. There were something like 18 massive missions that occurred from 780 to 813 under Charlemagne's leadership. One of a 10th century monk called the Monk of St. Gall, I think his name is like Thomas the Stammerer or something is his official name. He wrote the first biography of Charlemagne, and in it he describes this interconnection, this meeting between Charlemagne's embassy and Harun al-Rashid. And I'll say a bit more about this, but I wanted to first just read his description of this, where describing it, he says, "At this site, Harun, the most powerful of all of the rulers who inherited that name," which means the just, recognized from such minute indications the superior might of Charlemagne, and he began to praise him in the following words: "Now I realize that what I have heard of my brother Charles being Charlemagne, is true. By going hunting so frequently and by exercising his mind and body with such unremitting zeal, he has acquired the habit of conquering everything under heaven. What can I offer him in return that is worthy of him, seeing that he has gone to such trouble to honor me? If I give him the land which was promised to Abraham and shown to Joshua, it is so far away that he cannot defend it from the barbarians. If, with his customary courage, he tries to defend it, I'm afraid that the provinces bordering on the kingdom of the Franks may secede from his empire. All the same, I will try to show my gratitude for his generosity in the way which I have said. I will give the land to him, so that when he may hold it, I myself will rule over it as his representative. Whenever he wishes, and whenever the opportunity offers, he may send his envoys to me. He will find me a most faithful steward of the revenues of that province. Do people get what just occurred there? Anybody can speak. Do they have a sense of what was just offered by Harun al-Rashid to Charlemagne?
Yeah, the Holy Land.
The Holy Land, exactly. So he actually did a massive flank against the imperialists of Rome, of Byzantium, and the ultramontane church. That is the church that this very corrupt dynamic within the Western church, premised around the idea that Constantine had given all of the lands to the church, so that the church is the rightful controller of the material as well as of the spiritual realm, which one could see how useful that would be if you want to manage puppet kings and create wars artificially. That's a very useful idea. Now, it was later proven by Nicholas of Cusa that donation of Constantine was a forgery, and it never really did happen. It was always made up. But Harun al-Rashid flanks those who were able to and desirous of creating these conflicts over the Holy Land. That the Holy Land is, it belongs to the Christians, and yet the Jews, the Muslims are controlling it, and we have to take it back. We have to go to war. So the Crusades, that'll happen much later, could have easily have happened a lot sooner had this type of beautiful gift not occurred, where Harun gives the Holy Land to Charlemagne instead of going to war. And he says, I'm going to be your steward. I'll collect the revenues for your province, and I will give you the taxes, the revenues, whenever you want, and I'll protect it for you. He also sends an elephant, gifts of silk and spices and other things to Charlemagne, and it's shown in great gratitude in return. In return, one of the things that Abraham ibn Daud, who's another philosopher and historian, wrote a book called The Book of Tradition in 1161, describing Charlemagne. He wasn't just benefiting from the enlightened thinking of the Khazars or Harun al-Rashid, but this really just demonstrates nicely and quickly the type of reciprocal diplomatic maneuvering that Charlemagne had offered as well, where the King Charles, Ibn Daud says, the King Charles sent to the king of Baghdad, Caliphate, requesting that he dispatch one of his Jews of the seed of royalty of the house of David. So there are still people living in Baghdad who follow their lineage to the house of David, and who thus have a claim for the throne, wherever a Jewish kingdom should exist or Jewish rulership should ever find itself. So he calls for the Harun to find somebody of the house of David. He hearkened and sent him one from there, a magnate and sage named Rabbi Makir by name. And Charles settled him in Narbonne, the capital city. And that's the capital city in Septimania, which we'll look a little at an image of it. I think I have one. And planted him there and gave him a great possession there at the time he captured it from the Ismailites, the Arabs, the Umayyads. And he, Makir, took a wife, a woman from among the magnates of the town. And the king made him a nobleman and designed out of love for Makir good statutes for the benefit of all the Jews dwelling in the city, as is written and sealed in a Latin charter. And the seal of the king therein bears his name Carolus, and it is their possession at the present time. The Prince Makir became chieftain there. He and his descendants were close interrelated with the king and all his descendants. So under one story, Charlemagne even, and this has not been verified in my mind, but a few sources have said that this is the case, that Charlemagne even gave one of his daughters to Prince Makir for marriage. solidify this diplomatic maneuver, and that Prince Makir also gave one of his daughters to Charlemagne, or one of Charlemagne's lieutenants, but I don't know for sure, so don't quote me on that. Now this is Septimania. This is all Charlemagne's kingdom in 771. It still got a little bit bigger after this image, but this is the kingdom. We have a small little area here of a Spanish march. But Septimania used to be Arab, and he took this zone over. This is Narbonne. This is the port city where all the Silk Road goods and the goods from Africa and the Middle East come through. Now, Septimania is also run by, it's 1/3 Jewish, 1/3 Muslim, 1/3 Christian. And that's also very, very important. So, hold on, just gotta get that out here. Yeah, so you have the Islamic Viscount who controls a third, the Archbishop Thomas of Normandy controls a third, and the Jewish king controls a third of the administrative functions of Narbonne. And again, this is like a major economic lever of the entire kingdom. It's not a small, it might look like a small territory, but it is a hugely strategic zone. So that's, again, a lot of faith from a Christian king to put into Muslims and Jews to co-run a zone and actually lead it. I'm going to look at the partitioning here of Verdun at the end. But the Ultramontane, because like I said, Pierre Baudry in his writings makes this point quite well with a lot of quotes. I'm going to make a link to a lot of his work, his online work. But the forces in opposition to the sort of Samuel P. Huntington ideologues of the day, in opposition to this sort of alliance, was the Ultramontane Church, the papacy, the Venetians, who desired to control global trade, especially on the sea, and that is ultimately what they ended up doing a little bit later on successfully, and forces within the Byzantium Empire. Not that all forces within Byzantium were corrupt, but leading bloodlines, members of the ancient Roman aristocracy found themselves in Byzantium running a lot of very dirty operations, running wars. So there were three different core elements. There were others, but those are the three big ones, always working to disrupt this mode of thinking. Pope Stephen II, Archbishop Adalbert, who's a trusted leader under Charlemagne's rule, chastises him. And he says, look, Christians work the vineyards and fields of those Jews. Christian men and women live under the same roof as these provocateurs, listening to their blasphemous language day and night. These miserable men and women always have to humiliate themselves before the demeaning display of dogs. What communion hath light with darkness? What concord hath Christ with Belial? So, not a very enlightened thinker, but really trying to coerce and force, threaten Charlemagne to undo these policies. So what ultimately happened here? You have everything moving in a direction towards ecumenicism through, like I said, unifying for thriving. That was and a very, very heightened philosophy of diplomatic governance, and also this idea of the mandate of heaven to cultivate your own people within your own nations to make them better through internal improvements in China, Middle East, Khazaria, and the Frankish kingdom. So what went wrong? And I mean, this is where it's useful to look at the breakup. So after the deaths of Charlemagne and Harun, even though their sons are not bad people, they work to maintain the continuity, and they do to a certain extent. Things are still moving ahead throughout the 820s, 830s. But there's a civil war that breaks out in the Abbasid dynasty between two sons of Harun al-Rashid who fight for control of the kingdom. One ends up dominating and winning. I think his name is Al-Mamun, and his brother was Al-Amin, who was the caliph for a few years. But Al-Mamun ends up taking full control. And he does manage to advance and continue his father's program. However, number one, Charlemagne's son is okay as well, continues to advance this program, but his grandchildren are not so smart. And what we have there with the partition of Verdun is the foundation of a lot of the insanity of today's Europe. If you want to understand where today's Europe comes from and how the empire has been able to manage wars, forever wars like the 30 Years' War in Europe, the 100 Years' War, World War I and II, French and German wars, they got to look at why was this carved up this way between the kingdoms of Charles, Louis, and Lothar, the three grandchildren of Charlemagne. And when that decision was made to partition the kingdom, as well as signing the Treaty of Strasbourg, which was a Venetian orchestrated treaty where Charles and Louis basically arranged in treaty form to gang up on their brother and to forever have an alliance between the two of them whenever an opposition would occur between them and their brother, who had this very strategic zone in the middle, which could always be used to make conflict happen amongst the Europeans. This was just insane. And the wealth, the prosperity, the higher level thinking, we saw less and less traces of it at this point. China never fully recovered from the Anxi Rebellion. It was really, the Silk Road did continue. There was a continued development of poet philosophers, as we saw with Li Bai, who was a statesman as well as a great poet and painter, and many others of China, but they still never were able to recover from that division to the point of their collapse eventually. Now, what else happened? During this period, we had the Tang Dynasty ultimately collapse in 908. Eventually, the Song Dynasty comes in and does a lot of good, but the Tang Dynasty's collapse, mixed with the chaos and anarchy of the rest of the Western part of the world, really the Silk Road doesn't recover from that. By 968, the Khazar kingdom collapses, and it fully collapses by 1016 with the Kiev Rus takeover. Just a little bit after that, you have 1095, the Crusades are launched. So finally, things are insane enough, leadership is absent enough, such that the Venetian oligarchy is capable of manipulating the first of the Crusades. Sorry, what was that, Alex?
No, I'm sorry. I lost all the video for a while.
Oh, okay. All right, cool. So at that point, scholars also take note that the Crusaders, when they went into the Middle East to reconquer the Holy Land, they all followed the Radhanite trade routes. So those well-established trade routes that had been built up over a very long time were those that were taken over and followed by the Crusaders. You had, hold on 1 second. Yeah, sorry. By 1257, the Mongols had taken down Baghdad. There was not much left of the Abbasid dynasty, and Europe fell into a prolonged dark age. Mostly wars were what defined, so-called holy wars were what defined the next series of crusades, the second, the third, the fourth crusade. And it took a very long time for the world to recover and actually start creating a foundation of a new Augustinian principle of Platonic humanism in in Baghdad, which did happen later, as well as later, a little bit after that, in Europe with the Florentine Golden Renaissance. The issue of the Khazar kingdom, though, and how it's been wiped out, scrubbed out of history, to the point that today, I mean, most people who know of Khazaria that I've encountered online, just being interfacing with the alternative media world, the majority of people who know of it think of it primarily as a evil zone of Rothschild, Ashkenazi Jewry that is the heart of all the world's problems. That is really prevalent. That, you know, and it's for those people who really just tend to easily fall into low-level conspiratorial thinking, and they recognize that the Rothschilds are a banking dynasty which has done a lot of evil then and now. But there's a tendency to not use rigor in an investigation and thus blame the Jews for everything because they controlled a lot of the money bags in the course of the last several hundred years of empire. But empire precedes the Rothschilds by a long margin, and the Rothschilds themselves and the other Jewish bankers that have been used, we're going to see in a second how that came into being as a process, because it's not like they can do whatever they want to do. There is a higher operating power structure that even these families, these dynasties, whether it's the Rockefellers in the U.S., the Warburgs, the Rothschilds, name a key family. The Bronfmans in Canada, right, is a newer family. Any of these dynasties, the Bush dynasty is an even newer family, not that high level, but still. They all have to obey a certain hierarchical chain of command. The fact that Khazaria was the center of a system of anti-imperial philosophy and diplomatic maneuvers is a huge sleight of hand. And the fact that there's so little evidence of them isn't because the Khazars wanted to wipe evidence of themselves out of the history records the way people often say. It's because there was a systematic maneuver by the gatekeepers of history to destroy our ability to research what happened in the past in a way that would empower us into the future. Now, this is a small segment from my article on the Forgotten Christian-Muslim-Jewish Alliance, where I quote a historian, a very good historian named Cecil Roth, who's written extensively on the subject, and his methods are very rigorous, and I very much approve of his approach. I'm just going to try to lower the faces. Okay. Okay. Sorry, for myself, I just have to get rid of the faces so I can see the text. Sorry. All right, here we go. Okay, can people see all that text? Okay, I'm just gonna read it. All right. So, all right, so what happened when Khazaria fell? Anti-Jewish laws were imposed at unprecedented rates from the 11th to 16th centuries of Venetian global dominance. In the late 10th century, Jews were cut off from Khazaria as all east-west trade routes were taken over by Genoa and Venice. Though other nations soon followed suit, Venice was the first to ban Jews from all international trade, with the Venetian Senate passing a law in 945, Common Era, forbidding any ships shipped to Asia from carrying a Jew. Laws were soon passed across Europe on Venice's direction, forbidding Jews from owning land, joining trade guilds of weavers, dyers, carpenters, or blacksmiths, or owning any trade company. Other laws, like the 1181 English Aziz laws, forbade Jews from owning weapons, serving in military, or even farming. The word ghetto began in Venice as well, as Jews were here relegated to a small neighborhood called the ghetto, and were excluded from any normal form of profession, being forced to either deal in old rags, pawnbroking, or money lending for nominally Christian oligarchical families who used them as Hofjuden, which is court Jew servants. And I say nominal Christian because I don't think Augustine would approve of their attempt to pass themselves off as Christian even. But there were certain things that a lot of these families could not do, like usury, which is not strictly forbid as clearly as it is in the Jewish books of the Torah and Talmud. Even though it is forbidden in the Torah, actually, you cannot lend with interest. The way it is explicitly, it's more explicitly forbade in Islamic faith and Christian in the Bible. Historian Cecil Roth says, so you can see why they would be useful to basically use these Jews for doing things on the behalf of higher powers that those powers can't do themselves. Historian Cecil Roth said, the situation would have been an impossible one, but for the presence of the Jew, who, precisely as he found himself excluded from all other methods of gaining a livelihood, was forced into the most unhonored profession. The non-Jewish capitalists lent to kings and magnates under the cover of various devices, such as making out the bond for a larger amount than the sum lent, or euphemistically calling the interest by some other name. The more open, least lucrative, and most unpopular branches of the profession, such as lending on pledge for a short period to the artisan and tradesman, were forced upon the Jews. In Venice, for example, down to the close of the 18th century, the Jewish community was only tolerated on the express condition that it maintains in the ghetto 4 loan banks, or more polite term for pawnbroking establishments. The only other professions legally permitted there were old clothes dealing and the wholesale export trade to the Levant, which did not compete with Christian traders. The same was the case in the cities of the terra firma. This ignominious condition of affairs was sternly enforced, and any attempt on the part of the Jews to broaden their economic status or to place it on a slightly more dignified plane was systematically blocked. And this is what Shakespeare exposes quite well in, for those who have had the chance to watch or read the Merchant of Venice. All right. Stop this. Aha. All right. Yeah, so for those who've had the chance to read The Merchant of Venice, this is exactly what Shakespeare is exposing with the role of Venice and how Venice used the role of the Jew within the Venetian power structure, which degraded both the civilization as a whole, as well as the Jew who found themselves in the position of Shylock, who lent, on interest as a matter of being. The other books, like The Jew of Malta by Marlowe, also expose this in another way, but with a different set of dynamics taken into consideration. Othello also gets at the evils of Venice in another way, and the Venetian methods of getting fools to fight each other, whose real interests are actually in cooperation. Othello never had to kill his wife Desdemona or anybody else. So all that to say, there has been what you might say is a sleight of hand that's been run on the mass psyche by the very Venetians that did what they did to the Middle East, to the world, to, and I mean, keep in mind too, I mentioned that the Mongols committed such damage, right? We all know the story of the Mongols, at least many of the stories of the Mongols, that took over much of Asia, that destroyed the Abbasid dynasty, the Baghdad Renaissance centers, that made their way all the way through to Khazaria. The fact that Marco Polo was an advisor to the Khans is not a coincidence. The fact that the Venetians had a monopoly in, as far as being a European power to trade freely within Mongol-controlled territories is also not a coincidence. The fact that Venetians had the best intelligence on every kingdom and every personality of Europe and the Middle East that they would always use to initiate what what Shakespeare exposes in Othello, right? They were able to profile their enemies, their victims, to fight. They were able to give a lot of intelligence to the Mongols as well. They were able to use to their advantage in taking over kingdoms of the West. So I would just end it there. That's part of the history project that we're currently working on reconstructing properly as a way to define the new paradigm now emerging that I went through at the very beginning of my presentation. And in coming weeks, we'll continue this series on universal history with presentations by Cynthia Chung on some very underappreciated aspects of the Roman Republic and the fight to keep Rome from becoming an empire, as well as Assad, who's going to be going through some deeper material on the Islamic Renaissance or the Arab Renaissance principle more generally. Other presentations afterwards will deal with the American Revolution, Hamiltonian system of political economy that came out of that, and maybe a few things on science and other yet to come. So I'll end it there. If there's any questions or just open discussion people want to have, we can do that.
Thank you, Matt. This is Marcella. I have to exit. I got 2 dogs here demanding to be fed.
Oh, that's fine, Marcella. Thank you for coming by, and also for teaching, helping your dogs learn about some universal history.
Yes, they listened quietly for a while. Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Hope to see you next week. Okay.
Matt,
Yep.
I have a question. So did after like 900, was there still a lot of suppression of Jewish trade and so forth? And do you think that that can build up a lot of resentment over a couple thousand years?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much every nation of Europe, or every baronial and kingdom within Europe, pretty much followed Venice's lead. After Venice started passing their restrictions on Jewish trade and other things, and also just generally like isolating them to ghettos. That did follow suit. England followed suit. Spain did so. I mean, a lot of places did. Spain continued actually with a lot of tolerance compared to other parts. When you say resentment, do you mean would resentment be felt by the Jews who suffered for those hundreds of years, or do you mean resentment by those who didn't get to benefit from the trade routes that the Radhanites had enjoyed for a long time?
Well, I mean, you know, you hear a lot about how in the past this kind of thing has happened, and do you think that you know, Jews as a you know, a world population, wherever they may be, do they feel like they have you know, I guess things coming to them because of that, or anything along that?
Well, I wish Aaron were here, who gave our lecture last week on Augustine, who himself is Jewish, and he'd be much more equipped to think or talk about this. In my personal experience, we know that by looking at how different peoples have been played against each other in the Middle East, that specifically by the British Empire over the course of the 20th century and today, we know that you've got different factions within Judaism, just like you have different factions within Islam. You have oligarchical movements that have an imperial sort of way of thinking of their self-interest, and a very, very materialistic way of defining their identity and their spirituality around a blood and soil sort of cult of like, our physical homeland is our identity, and we will crush anybody who defies the greater Israel agenda. So you have certain followers of Benjamin Netanyahu, or you know, people of the Jabotinskyite sort of philosophy, who do see that Jordan, Syria, like a much bigger part of Israel than we currently see today, is the rightful domain of Israel, and they will do a lot of injustice to establish that along the way. But similarly, you have a lot of humanistic, rational, like proper spiritual people who see, who are even, you know, they might qualify themselves as Zionists. They believe in a homeland for the Jews, but they're not imperialist. You know, people like Yitzhak Rabin, for example, is a good example of this. The former prime minister of Israel, who was assassinated in 1995 when he was in the midst of organizing a two-state solution with Yasser Arafat under the Oslo Accords. Cynthia actually is in the midst of publishing something going in depth into this, which I highly recommend people read when it comes out on Strategic Culture this week. But yeah, you have people like Yossi Beilin, the justice minister, or the foreign minister, Yossi Beilin, foreign minister, who orchestrated the Oslo Accords, who are much more reasonable, much more moral, and much more cut from the, I'd say the Charlemagne cloth, you know, of of looking for ways to harmonize. They want a two-state solution, you know, with mutual respect of both sides. So, you know, you have both. And I think ultimately for the higher up oligarchs who have sort of Jewish names like the Rothschilds, I think that they know their place. From my assessment of the behavior of the Rothschild dynasty, they tend to follow orders like a good Hofjuden. And they know that they can't go renegade, and they don't historically. They're not allowed to marry up beyond a certain glass ceiling into the pure bloodlines. And yeah, they follow orders. But somebody's got to get their hands dirty.
Who do they follow orders from?
Well, this is where you want to look at what were what are the ruling inner families of the European aristocracy today. They're primarily concentrated in Europe, but I mean, there's all elsewhere where you have the old sort of the black nobility. The Rothschilds themselves were absorbed in the 17th century by Amschel Rothschild, who was just a coin dealer. They're sort of like a new dynasty that was sort of set up as good sociopaths to do a bidding. But if you look at the Queen's family, a lot of these inbred oligarchs today managing Europe, you have things like the Brooks Book of Peerage, which is something that's published every year. It sort of makes available all of the lineage, the family trees of these European aristocratic families. Some of them can trace it back to all the way to the Roman and Babylonian priesthood. So you got a higher, nasty cultural dynamic happening that precedes even, I would say, the existence of Judaism as an institution and Muslim and Islam and Christianity. It's an oligarchical, internally, consistently self-controlling parasite, which is part of just what's plagued the human experience. And they'll use whoever. They'll find whatever, corrupt it, and use it. That's what Shakespeare's exposing again in his Othello and Merchant of Venice, especially Othello. Marlowe does it too, actually. If you look at his Dr. Faustus, he's also exposing some of the Freemasonic techniques of brainwashing of the oligarchy in those works.
Would you say Shakespeare's portrayal of Shylock as a sympathetic character is one of the first of that type, or in drama?
Christine actually has a thought on this. Christine, why don't you take yourself off of mute there? Hold on. Christine's done probably more work than anybody that I know on this. So let me just mute myself so I don't echo. Okay, come here.
I don't really live up to Matt's introduction of that, but just to make a quick point that the Merchant of Venice, Shylock is the Jew that's like the focus character, but there are two other Jewish characters in the Merchant of Venice who disagree with how Shylock, his whole ideology and his priorities and what he's willing to do to exact revenge and these sorts of things. There's the famous speech where he says, "If we cut us, do we not bleed?" And so forth. He's having that conversation with another Jewish character who is judging Shylock as someone who's lost their way. And, his daughter is obviously not in agreement with Shylock either. And he's even ready to, sacrifice her. I think that John Barton, who is, he recently passed away. He's an academic from Oxford and Cambridge, but also one of the directors from the Royal Shakespeare Company. He's quite a big name. And a lot of people are asking him to write a book on his insights of Shakespeare. And instead, he said, you can't really do justice to Shakespeare as a book because Shakespeare needs to be heard and experienced. And so he did this wonderful class series. There's 9 of them, which are available on YouTube. Actually, we can send out a link to people. But in one of these lecture series, he focuses entirely on the Merchant of Venice because it is a very controversial play that a lot of people have taken, I think, too liberal of an interpretation of either it's anti-Jew or it's trying to create sympathy for the Jewish ways, but I think it's more complex than that. And John Barton does a really good job of comparing 2 actors who have both played Shylock and their interpretation of it. And one of these actors is a Jewish actor, and I think got it right. The other one was Patrick Stewart, actually, who you could see didn't really understand Shylock.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, because he makes the point that the problem with Shylock, when you look at these other 2 Jewish characters who are good people in the play, It's not that Shylock is bad because he's a Jew, but he's bad because he's a bad human being.
Well, he's been kind of he's been conditioned, or he's suffered under the stigma of the the stigmatization of being a Jew, I guess, and he's kind of acting it out.
Well, it's dynamic, right? It's complex. It's not so black and white because, I mean, in some ways, Shakespeare is sort of, he's not Aristotelian. It's not all A or all B. He is also intervening on those ignorant Christians who just blame Jews as well as being like subhuman by virtue of giving him those words to speak, that if you cut us, do we not bleed? If you do not wrong us, do we not revenge? But he goes through, it's a very, there's a lot of poignant philosophy in there in some ways, and he puts it in the mouth of a villain, which is one of the ironies that great artists do. Because and Plato does it a lot, Plato puts sometimes truths in the mouths of people who are sophists and villains, because he wants you to think. They want you to move your mind. They don't want to lecture you. And that's what great art and great philosophy actually is, and great teaching is, can you get the audience to move their mind? Can you give them ironies, paradoxes that will cause their mind to be in motion rather than imprinting upon them like a blank slate information, right? Which takes no account for their soul. And that's just what imperialists do, or people who believe in John Locke and the blank slate, or Aristotle, who doesn't believe in the soul. We're just behavior, little creatures to be conditioned in a behavioristic way. And that's all we are. It's just the sum of our behaviors and impulses, like a dog.
Matt, I have to
I think
go.
dogs are actually better than that. I think dogs have souls, but anyway.
I have to go myself.
Oh, hey, Patrick. Okay, cool. See you, buddy. And
Do you see it?
bye, Patrick's baby.
Etienne, say goodbye.
Oh,
to you.
Etienne.
Hello, guys.
Bye, Patrick.
Okay, auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Bye.